Hi everyone, here we go. Starting chapter 2, talking about chemistry. So, why chemistry? Well, because all things are made out of atoms and molecules. And so now we're talking about living things and what are the most common atoms of living things, what are the most common molecules, and what are their structures and what are their functions and how do they work together. So, chapter 2, chemistry, raw materials and fuel for our bodies. Okay. So, learning objectives. These are pretty important. Describe what atoms are. So, atoms, right? So, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen. What's their structure? How do they bond? Water. When we put atoms together, now we have molecules. So, water, H2O. It's hydrogen and oxygen. Pretty important. Describe carbohydrates. We're talking about carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen together, making carbohydrates, which are our sugars for energy. Describe lipids. You've all heard of lipids before. Lipids, we're talking about fats. So what is their function? Okay, not all fats are bad, and fats are not bad. It's just when it's too much, that's when it's bad. Proteins, you've all heard of proteins. And when we say proteins, what do you think of? You should think of muscle, yes. And so what's its function? And proteins, of course, not just muscle, but that's one example. Nucleic acids, we're talking about DNA and RNA. So if we say DNA and RNA, you're like, yep, I know what she's talking about. So these are the learning objectives and they're important. And with my tools here, I only have 15-minute lectures. So I'll probably gonna have part 1, part 2, and part 3 for chapter 2. And again, what I really love about this is with the PowerPoints, you can always go back. You can look at a slide, etc., for whatever you need. Or if you're there, you're like, hey, I got it, Miss Collins. I don't need this. Okay. So everything is made out of atoms, right? Atoms. They're the smallest unit of matter, okay? So if you've ever seen the periodic table, it has all of the atoms, all the elements. So gold is made out of gold atoms. Carbon's made out of carbon atoms. Copper is made out of copper atoms. Here's the basic anatomic structure of an atom. You always have a nucleus, right? The nucleus is in the middle. That has protons. Protons are positively charged particles. And neutrons are neutral. So there's no charge. And around, circulating around here, orbiting around the nucleus are the electrons. These are these little guys. And electrons are negatively charged. So if it's a carbon atom, it has a certain nucleus, certain amount of electrons. If it's a gold atom, it has nucleus with the protons, neutrons, and then its own electrons. So every element has its own atoms, and what differs one atom from another is the number of protons, the number of electrons, the number of neutrons. So here is the periodic table. Here it shows, like in one of those little squares, here's oxygen. And oxygen atomic number, the number of protons. Okay, so oxygen atoms always have 8 protons. And then they would have electrons orbiting around, right? The major players in our bodies, in living living organisms are hydrogen. Where is my hydrogen? It's a pointer. Hydrogen, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen. Those are the major players. So here, if you look, it says 25 elements found in your body and the big 4. So oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen. Those are the biggies. Guaranteed this is going to be a test question. So what are the major elements in our bodies and in living organisms? Oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen. And then these guys are found in much smaller quantities. So if you look, the big 4, they're 96% of our body. And then the other are about 4%. So here's the take-home message. I'm not going to talk about this. I don't want to waste the video time, but you please read the take-home messages because they're important, right? I said I'm not going to read it. Here I go. Everything around us, living or not, is made out of atoms. So the table, The chairs are made out of atoms. Non-living things are made out of atoms, and living things are made out of atoms, okay? The smallest unit into which the material can be divided, okay? Atoms, same general structure. So protons, neutrons in the middle, in the nucleus, and then electrons surrounding. Okay, here they are. All right, so atoms' electrons determine whether and how the atoms will bind. So if you just have a carbon, it's just a carbon. But you put carbon and hydrogen together, they form a bond. And oxygen, they form a bond. It's like H2O. There's 2 hydrogen atoms, there's 1 oxygen atom. Bind together, now they make a water molecule. So atoms bind with their electrons, and that's important. Okay, so here's oxygen, here are the electrons and the electrons. Okay. All right. Atoms bind to form molecules, okay? And how do they bind? Again, definite exam question. They're going to bind with their electrons, okay? Here's the nucleus. The first electron shell is full with 2 electrons. The second electron shell is filled with 8. And the atoms want to fill those electron shells. And when they do it with other atoms, okay? So here, for example, this shows a molecule. It's 2 or more atoms bound together, okay? So here's a carbon atom bound to a hydrogen, bound to a hydrogen, hydrogen, hydrogen. This symbol right here, it symbolizes a bond. This is a chemical bond. Specifically, it's called a covalent bond. So putting the atoms together, now we have molecules, okay? So water is a molecule. Proteins are molecules. So here are 2 hydrogen atoms. They can share their electrons. When they share their electrons, they form a bond, and this specific bond is called a covalent bond. So one of the questions I can ask you is, how do atoms bind? They bind with their electrons. What are the different types of bonds? So one of the major bonds is a covalent bond. And what's happening is the atoms share their electrons. And when they share the electrons, it binds these 2 atoms. Another type of bond is an ionic bond. With ionic bonds, the atoms aren't sharing their electrons. They're gaining or losing an electron. And why would they do that? Well, they do it because they want to fill their outer electron shell. Now, electrons, if you remember, they're what charge? Yes, negative. So if this guy is going to gain a negative charge, this guy becomes more negative. If this guy is going to lose a negative charge, he still has his protons here, so he becomes more positive. When the guy becomes more negative, we call it an ion, and see it's negative. When the guy becomes more positive because he lost an electron, we call it an ion also. And the fact that these 2 guys, this one is more positive and this one's more negative, that creates a bond. And they're attracted to one another. So if you look, it says opposite charges attract. And they do, and they form a bond. Right? And here is something that you're all very familiar with. This is salt, sodium chloride. And it's sodium atoms. Now they're ions because they lost that electron. And chlorine, they're ions also because they gained. And they form that bond and they make the compound salt. Okay. So covalent bonds are one type of bond where they share electrons. Ionic bonds is another type of bond where they gain or lose electrons. And I'm going to put some videos up so you can look at them because videos are always so helpful. Third type of major bond is called a hydrogen bond. Now, hydrogen atoms, they don't seem that spectacular. It's just 1 proton, 1 electron. But when they bind with things, right, and the electrons kind of get pulled this way, this part gets a little more positive. And when it gets more positive, there's that thing called polarity. And then that might get this hydrogen atom more attracted to another atom. And they're very, very weak bonds, where's my pointer? My pointer is leaving me. They're very weak bonds, okay? And this guy is more negative because it has more electrons. This guy is more positive because it has the proton. And that weak bond is called a hydrogen bond. Now, the hydrogen bonds, they're like, who cares? What does it matter? Well, they actually do matter. They're very weak bonds. They help molecules like get their shape. They also, like with water and cohesion, hydrogen bonds are important for that. And so we're going to talk about that. Okay, so the lesson. 3 types of bonds. Covalent, where the atoms are doing what with their electrons? Okay. Ionic, where atoms are doing what? Right? And then finally, hydrogen. Okay, so those are the 3 major types of bonds. There they are. Summary, 3 types. Covalent, where they're sharing. Ionic, where they gain or lose electrons. Or hydrogen, weak polarity, right? So those are the 3 major ones for sure. Exam question. Okay. All right, so now we talked about atoms, right? Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, major guys. And then bonds, they're bonding with one another to make molecules. Now the rest of the lecture is all about the major types of molecules, okay? So if you look at this picture, what do you see? What is that? Yeah, you see sunflowers in the background, yeah. But we're talking about water. These are water droplets. So the first major molecule we're going to talk about is water. Water is not alive, yes. Molecules are not alive, okay? Not yet. But water is important for life, okay? Cells need water. All right, so water has features that enable it to support all life. All right, so here are the major features, okay? I love summary slides. So this is a summary slide. So water has cohesion, large heat capacity, low density as a solid, and a good solvent, okay? So these are biggies. You need to know the slide. Okay, so what do these things mean? So for example, whenever they go into space and they're like, does this planet have life, or does this planet have life? And when they're looking, they generally look for water. Why? Okay, because water has these properties that allow life to occur, and cells really use these things, and bodies really use these things, organisms use these things. Okay, so cohesion, right? What do you think cohesion means? Think of the words. Always think of the words. What do they mean? Cohesion. It's cohesive. Cohesion means the water molecules want to stick together, yeah? If water molecules want to stick together, why is that important? So the previous slide, right, shows, right, this thing, this is like surface tension. The fact that the water molecules want to stick together creates a surface tension, allows the spider to walk on water, okay? Well, okay, what does that mean? And when we look at this, here, plants need water to go to their leaves. They have to pull the water out of the ground to get to the leaves. Well, plants don't have a heart like we do, right? So how do they do this? Well, the water molecules stick together, and the fact that they do is they help pull the water up towards the leaves, and that's where the photosynthesis is happening. So cohesion, major important property of water. Here, creates that surface tension, means nothing to you right now, but that's important. High heat capacity. Okay, what does that mean? What it means is it takes a lot of energy to heat a body of water compared to other things. Well, who cares? What does that mean? Well, what that means is like organisms that live in the ocean temperature is not going to change that quickly. I'm not going to fry the organisms that are living there. I'm going to go ahead and stop here, and then we're going to have part 2.